parties for sentencing and for status on Grier's other cases.
Welcome to the News Channel 9 Stream Center. We have some breaking news to tell you about now from a Hamilton County courtroom where you are looking live, where Andre Grier has just been sentenced to life in prison. That was just handed down by the same jury that convicted him of all 5 charges yesterday, including murder. Again, this is a live look inside the Hamilton County courtroom that you're seeing. This is just happening right now. We paused a moment to let that happen in real time and then came to you live because of some of the security concerns for the jury. The judge did not want the jurors' voices to go out live. So now what you're hearing is Judge Boyd Patterson talking to the jury and talking to Mr. Grier. You can see him right below me. That's the live look there. He going back and forth in his chair a little bit. He gave no visible reaction when that was read. You can see him stand now as the jury leaves the courtroom. This wraps up about a week of both testimony, deliberation, opening statements, closing statements, lots of talk about safety and security of witnesses. But Andre Grier, we now know, will receive life in prison for the murder of Bianca Horton. She was killed in 2016, prosecutors say, because she was ready to identify a gang member, Cortez Sims, in a different shooting. And after she identified him in a juvenile court hearing, testimony revealed that members of a Chattanooga gang then coordinated to, quote, silence her. She was then kidnapped and killed. Her body left on the side of the road in Chattanooga. Again, a young mother of 3 children. You can see Andre Grier now looking at the camera for a moment before he's led out of the courtroom after just learning his fate of life in prison. Our Lily Butler is in the courtroom now. We know that after these are read, sometimes there are outbursts from the family. Sometimes there is emotion in the courtroom. So we will be watching for that. Again, safety and security, such a big part of this here in this trial, because this trial was all about being targeted because of what this witness, Bianca Horton, was willing to say in open court. They said that she was a strong woman. She was not going to let fear keep her from speaking. One of her young children, then an infant, was shot in the original shooting that she was preparing to testify for against Cortez Sims. Some of the testimony we heard in this case talked about people coordinating, even from jail, jailhouse phone calls, jailhouse letters, about how to keep Bianca Horton from testifying in court, which ultimately, prosecutors say, led to her being murdered. Again, if you're just joining us, just yesterday around noontime, so about 25 hours ago, that jury decided that Andre Grier was guilty of murder, of especially aggravated kidnapping, and 3 other charges. Now, that same jury, after hearing arguments from the defense and the prosecution, has sentenced him to life in prison. Some of what they spoke about today in the sentencing hearing was Bianca Horton's children and how they will never get their mother back. The defense also bringing up Andre Grier's children and how sending him to prison for life or the death penalty, which was on the table here. Again, the jury didn't decide to go that route, but it was a possibility. The defense talking about how his children wouldn't be able to see him anymore, but the prosecution coming back and saying that Bianca Horton's children don't have a choice. They're unable to see their mother because she was murdered, again, for being willing to speak out against a gang member in Chattanooga. What we've heard in this case is a lot of the research that CPD has done about how gangs in Chattanooga communicate with each other, their structure, how they work here. We're planning a more in-depth look into that in the coming days and weeks, as this really gives us a perspective of what is going on in some of our streets here in Chattanooga. This case has been years in the making. Some of the problems that they came upon when they were first trying to get that first conviction of the Cortez Sims trial, we saw gang members go up to testify here in this case tell the jury, the judge, they didn't know anything about this, but then they would play recordings from 2018 when they sat down with police officers where they did admit that they heard Andre Grier plan the death of Bianca Horton. So again, a difference in what they were willing to say in open court and what they were saying to police in a closed door meeting a couple years ago. I'm seeing now that Lily Butler is joining us. Lily, I'm going to bring you in now. That just happened moments ago in the courtroom. Life in prison for Andre Grier. Tell us what the mood was like in that courtroom when that sentencing verdict came down.
Yeah, hey Latricia. So Andre Greer's family actually just got to go back. The security in the courtroom told them they would have 10 minutes with Andre before following, this decision. Certainly tears in the gallery, but with the possibility that this could have been a death penalty. Not quite sure what those necessarily meant, but just as we heard, life in prison, and this is followed by yesterday, family members of Andre Greer, getting up on the stand and telling jurors about his upbringing and how a tough childhood may have affected, certain decisions in his life and certain actions. And then also how a death penalty for Andre Greer would affect his kids. Now, after that, prosecutors reminded those jurors how Bianca Horton's murder might have affected her kids. So certainly, a lot to think about for those jurors. And, they were reminded multiple times of the weight of this decision and ultimately decided life in prison. And we did clarify this means no parole for Andre Greer. We just had to clarify that with members of the prosecution after this, and they told us this would mean a flat 60 years and no parole for Greer.
And Lily, you have seen the jurors, you've seen kind of their reactions throughout this. What can you tell us about, did they show emotion throughout the trial? Did they pay closer attention to one thing or the other? What can you tell us about their demeanor throughout this last week?
And, Latricia, like you mentioned, them being neutral, pretty neutral, that was really the emotion coming from, the lack of emotion coming from the jurors this week. They were all fairly neutral. I was paying close attention to that just to see sort of the emotion that a case like this might bring to civilians. And yeah, again, remained pretty neutral. I will say they asked the question to the judge, because the jurors were allowed to ask questions throughout this trial to certain witnesses. And they had asked, I know you had mentioned just before I got on here the differing testimonies that we heard throughout this trial, some that were saying different things on the stand than we could hear in interviews they were saying to police in 2018. And the jurors had asked that question before they reached the verdict yesterday. They had asked, which of these testimonies are we allowed to believe? Are we allowed to use both as evidence? And the judge clarified to them that, when you're deciding which one to use as your evidence, you get to use common sense to choose which of those to believe.
And Lily, some of those we heard, but were these recordings that we heard from some of the accused gang members and some of the other people that changed their stories? These were with police officers in 2018 who were investigating the first case. Is that right? Or is that right after Bianca Horton was killed? What timeline do we know about when some of those recordings were taken?
Yeah, so the recordings, as far as I know, were all in 2018, but that was for the investigation of Bianca Horton's murder, when police began getting, sort of details and were able to narrow down suspects. They chose these people to interview based on what they had heard. Now, we also know that some of those accused gang members or other lay witnesses had attorneys present for these interviews, something that the defense had pointed out may be, a hint that they were giving up names in exchange for lesser sentences of their own or something else. But we do know that some of them had attorneys present in these interviews that they did with investigators and with police.
And then, like you said, we've talked about a little bit about the security. you've covered some other court cases. Talk about how this trial coverage was different and what we could and couldn't do versus what we are typically able to do as the media involved in a court case in open court.
Yeah, Latricia, this one had stricter parameters than almost any other case I've covered, and that is because of the allegations here and what the state had accused Andre Grier of doing, killing a witness. So the witnesses in this case were very protected. We weren't allowed to use their voice, their name. And then the other part about that is the expert witnesses that we were allowed to broadcast and use, they would occasionally mention names of some of these lay witnesses in their testimony. So we had to be extra careful not to include that. Another reason why we weren't able to live stream during this was just in the event that one of those expert witnesses mentioned a name, or, you could hear the voice. The jurors were also, very protected during this. So we couldn't live stream the entirety of the verdict because of, the fact that jurors read that, and they were wanting to be extra careful about the voices that were heard during this trial. Even for us, media, the security inside that courtroom has been taking precautions. I know they told us today, we've been sitting in the general gallery for the whole trial, and they told us today for this sentencing verdict that they wanted us seated on the front row. That's blocked off a little ways just in case, just to increase security. So it has been very secure inside of that courtroom, and we've been given a lot of parameters because of it.
And Lily, I did want to ask you, you listened to 2 different days worth of testimony from one of the CPD gang experts. What do you think was one of the things or a couple of the things that you heard that really stuck with you about some of the gang activity that they say is going on in our city?
Yeah, Latricia, for the state, that was for sure their most lengthy witness. He took the stand for the most of the time. So I think that, that provided jurors with a lot of the background that was necessary to understand the motive that the state was saying was used in this case to murder Bianca Horton. And, he talked about the rivalries within gangs. One thing that really stood out to me was that both of the gangs they say are involved in this case, which are the Bounty Hunter Bloods and the Athens Park Bloods, originated from LA. And they have, documentation that shows them sending finances from LA to and from, and, shows sort of the founders of these gangs here in Chattanooga and how they moved from LA to Chattanooga. But certainly a lot of things going on that we just as civilians aren't always aware of.
And then the defense coming back and kind of countering that, right? And what was the quote that the defense used? You act like these people are the mafia, right? Was that something that the defense said?
Yes, defense attorney Kit Rogers, I believe, used that in opening and closing arguments, just kind of saying, they act like these gangs in Chattanooga are the mafia, implying that, that may not be the case. But based on some of the things we heard from the gang expert that they found in their own investigations, he even said, the gang expert said that these gangs in Chattanooga, their primary goal is to do criminal activity in Chattanooga. And that is, the basis of their organization. So we've heard a little bit of conflicting statements on that end of, the intensity of these gangs in Chattanooga. But yeah.
All right, Lily, thanks so much for your coverage now. We know that you're going to work on getting some of the highlights of what we heard today, this morning from the attorneys and the prosecution to bring to us on News Channel 9 at 5. But thanks for keeping us updated all this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And follow along on Facebook for more coverage. We'll have updates there soon and on the web.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks so much, Lily. Again, as we wrap up here, Andre Grier found will be spending his life in prison without parole on the decision of an out-of-town jury brought in to hear this case in the murder of Bianca Horton, a 2016 death of a young mother who was prepared to testify against a Chattanooga gang member. Stay with us as we wrap up coverage tonight on our website, newschannel9.com, as well as News Channel 9 at 5 and 6. Have a good